that would change a world. From there I started writing a lot of, and parents don't usually address you. Biggest university in India. I am a writer, poet. Hello, I'm Akansha. You can find my first video on Ambitious Talks, which is on my journey. And now I will talk about my book, which is called Letters from Fall. It is on Notion Press and Amazon, and you can find it there. About my book, which is Letters from Fall, I started writing when I was in seventh class. So I wrote little poetries or little stories, and I would just tell my teacher that I wrote this, and they would laugh because I used to have many grammatical mistakes, which is okay. You can have grammatical mistakes and still write nice poetries. While I was in my seventh class, I also got introduced by Emily Dickinson, who was one of the most phenomenal poet and writer. You could always go and find about her poetries and think about, oh, it's not that deep. You can connect to it. I was also keen towards one of the most prohibited type of concept, which is death, and she used death as her muse in her poetries, which was new to me. I thought that you could never write about death, write about solitude, write about grief, but she used to write about those things, and that inspired me a lot to write about how I would have write about that. And also, when I wrote about solitude and grief, I used to most probably express myself or my grief or my solitude. But that's what you do with poetry. You write things, and then those things connects with the reader, and they connect it with your feelings, and they evaluate the most underestimated feelings of themselves, which is most of the time they don't acknowledge that fear or acknowledge that feeling. One of the most important people in my life is Walt Whitman. Also, he's a poet, and he used to write in a way that broke traditions of writing techniques. Like, you have to go on a certain parameter to write about things, but Walt Whitman was very different from that. He used to write things in his own way, and he won't just participate in the long ride of people, or he won't go with the herd. He would always do something which is new to him, or just what he feels right. Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman are those poets who inspired me the most, and most of my poetries would have their imagery in them. And when you talk about solitude, you always find it when you were young. Many people leave you, and sometimes you don't know how to express, and that's how people go into mental illness type of thing, like depression, anxiety, or abandoned disorder. All of these things comes with when people start to grow or people start to leave you. But when that happened to me when I was in 12th, I started writing it. And I didn't started writing it in a poetry. I was like I used to write a scribble rant on Tumblr, or used to write somewhere in my notebook or somewhere in the note. I used to just take a piece of paper and pen. I used to write it, and slowly I thought that maybe I should grow it a little bit and just write a little sonnet, and that sonnet developed into poems, and that poems developed into 50-60 poetries, and that's how I wrote this book. And you always have to always have to get triggered by something that will one day heal you from all the things that have every time triggered you. Like, you have to be patient with your own self. You don't have to be harsh on yourself, or like go like this is not happening and this is not going right, and your solitude is like just darkening your space. You don't have to do that. You don't have to be hard on yourself. Just find yourself in that solitude. You will always find a little voice which is your voice, and you have to just concentrate on that voice and lead yourself to that voice, because somehow that's the person who wants to connect to you, and that's the person who wants your help. And solitude will always be your friend, because none of us are ready for the world. We should always be our friends first, and then we should be friends to other people. You cannot be friend with anyone else if you're not friend with yourself. And So you have to acknowledge that solitude. You have to be in an alone place. You have to be with yourself and just express or just explore yourself, because there is nothing more than yourself to you. And one of the things that are written in this book is tragedies and grief. When you grow up, you always find that life is not easy. You always find that people are always there to either give you trouble, or you yourself give you trouble. So when these things happens, these tragedies happen, this grief happen, this whole misery happens, you don't have to lay back and go like that, this is not what I wanted. You always have to be ready for it, or always have to be expressive towards it. You don't have to just put your feelings in a door and lock it. You have to just feel it so that you can express it to people, or you could heal it. So when you start to feeling a little down, just know that you have to be a friend to yourself, or you have to be your own partner for that. And when you talk about all these things, solitude, grief, and amusement in death or anything, you cannot leave people like Emily Dickinson. One of her poem that was about death is which was inspiring to me, because nobody used to write about that. And when I read that, I was very inspired by it. And I was also inspired by how Greek mythology has its impact on literature. You can go around and find Ophelia stories or Hades stories anywhere. So Greek mythology has also been a part or an impact on my poetries and my writings, because I was always in towards knowing about mythology and everything. So when you talk about Greek mythology, there are many things, or many figures of God that are most you can relate to it. I mean, you can relate to Persephone, you can relate to any of the gods, because gods do mistake too. That's what it is in Greek mythology, and it was an impactful thing to me. When I read about Emily Dickinson's love poems, I just got to know that when she didn't publish any of her poems or any poetries while she was alive, all of her poems were written or published after she died. Most of her poems were published without her name, or she just wanted to participate in writing. And when she died, her poems were found in little boxes, little drawers. And that hit me, because you don't have to be famous for being a writer. You don't have to be famous for being a poet, being an amazing poet that has such an impact on literature. You just have to write poetries. You just have to write about how you feel, because poetry is not about being famous or getting appreciation from everybody else. You just have to be your own self while you're writing, while you are doing poetries, while you are participating in literature. You just have to be yourself. That's what I felt and what I saw in Emily Dickinson's poem. My inspiration just doesn't come from Greek mythology or Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman. It also comes with how I am seeing the world. Like, I would go around and see someone weeping and someone crying, and I would participate. I would just morally be there with her or them. And while I'm there with them, I cannot console them with my words. So I feel like I should write it, and that's how I participate in my inspirations for how my poems are inspired with other people or other tragedies, because it's a world where you go around and you just see things, and sometimes those things are the only things that inspires you. And that's how you should write about how you feel. And you just have to know that poetries and literature are not only about being a person who is valued, or who is evaluated person for literature or for poetries. You have to be someone who would express themselves or express someone else with words, and just you have to build an imagery for people who would find peace in your reading or in your writing. One of the things that I have learned while I was writing is that while I was writing, I used to write about my feelings or my fears or my illness from the mental health that I got. When I was going through a rough page of my life, I used to write about it. But then I realized that most of people don't write about it. Most of the people are told that you have to just let go of the feeling and don't have to go around and tell everybody about it. And those suppression becomes a mental illness on people. And that's where the main tragedies and main fear comes out. And you don't have to suppress your feelings. You don't have to go around and just lock yourself somewhere. You have to talk about yourself, and you have to, if you want to talk about it, you want to write about it, just go ahead and write. Don't suppress it. Mental illness and mental health is the most important thing around this world. And I would always say that if you're feeling some kind of way or you're feeling little down, you just have to express yourself. Well, I was struggling from my mental illness, or you could say my grief or my solitude. One thing that I didn't want it for others was I didn't wanted them to go through the same thing that I went through. And for that, I would go through anything for others to not feel what I felt or what I dealt with. And for that, we're starting a new thing which is called Human Library, where you could come and tell us about yourself, and your whole personality would not be judged, would not be calculated on the parameters of being a healthy person or being an ill person. You just have to express yourself, because while you are suppressing that, it will cause a wound one day in your heart, and we don't want that. So you could just come around and tell us about how you feel, and we will heal. We will try to hear you, because most of the time we just want people to hear us. Thank you so much for having me. You can subscribe to Ambitious Talks for more inspirational stories and people to know about. Thank you.